and food history at Historic Deerfield Museum. She has a BA in history from Mount Holyoke and a Diplôme culinaire from the New England Culinary Institute. Ms. Moore writes about historical perspectives on community food security and, the intersection of with women's history. Her writing on food topics has appeared in the Hampshire Gazette and at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. Please help me welcome Elyse Moore.
Thank you, Penny. It's nice to see you. I am not muted, I hope.
Oh,
can you hear me?
You're good, yes.
Okay. So I'm having some technical difficulties, but I think we're gonna go with it anyway. So excellent efforts by Holyoke Gas and Electric to build, operate, and sustain the Fishway in Holyoke focuses our attention on the present. But what about the story of Fishway's past? Today, I would like to explore the importance of shad and other migratory or anadromous fish to the inland diet and the close cultural relationship that developed between fish and the people who lived along the Connecticut River. We will learn about the earliest methods of Native American methods of harvesting fish, about early laws from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the early state of Massachusetts that protected fish populations as they ascended the river in their season. And I'd like to get going right away here with a little bit of talk about an article that appeared in the Springfield Republican by an unknown author, an unknown or unnamed journalist. So I've got a picture of the Springfield Republican publisher, Samuel Bowles, here on the screen. And the article was entitled "The Famous May Luxury, the Decline of Shad Fishery, a Food Fish Lost to the People." This article appeared in that year at the height of the Connecticut River shad run in the middle of May. The migration of the fish from the ocean to their natal spawning grounds in the cool, calm, and shallow tributaries and ponds of the Connecticut River watershed. The problem, of course, was that there was a connection between the Massachusetts and Connecticut fisheries that stopped. My notes are not updated, so I'm going to kind of wing it. But the article shows that the connection between Massachusetts and Connecticut prevented fish from coming across the border into Massachusetts. And the reason that was prevented was because of a number of techniques that caught fish before they were even as far north as the Essex Connecticut River Museum, very close to the mouth of the Connecticut River. So fyke nets and pound nets and gill nets were all placed in the mouth of the river so that southern Connecticut fishermen could harvest the abundance that was just coming into the stream, the channel basically that's coming up the Connecticut River. And fish find their way. If any of you listened to Andy Fisk's presentation last fall, you'll remember that he talked about how fish find their way through channels and along the bottoms by pathways that they remember, and these channels were noted by fishermen, and the fish were caught in these kinds of net systems placed right in those channels, and any fishways that might have been developed along, say, the Enfield Dam were pushed off to the side along what was not the fish channel. So the fishways were really sort of useless unless they were placed in the way that the fish could find their way through. So the people in Massachusetts took great exception to the fact that the Connecticut fisheries took the lion's share of the fish. And by the 1880s, when this article appeared in the Springfield Republican, the entire previous year's harvest was 600 shad in the 2 months of April and May, whereas it had been hundreds of thousands of fish, which we still are now seeing today again. So this was a big deal, and we're going to take a look at how that happened and what we can do to understand history through this lens. So where are we talking about? We're talking about these maps that show both a historic look at the Connecticut River watershed between about the Brattleboro area, a little bit north of Brattleboro. You're in the Sokoke homeland there, and you can see Fort Dummer just below that. Pecumtuck, which is where Deerfield is, the Nonotuck in Northampton, the Agawam, that whole area with all its little tributaries and streams is or was at that time not dammed like you see in the map on the right that shows us. I need to move this. Thank you very much. That shows us a selection of 22 dams, but this right-hand map really represents more than the 1,000 dams in the Connecticut River watershed. So a huge difference in the way that people related to the river at that time. The Native American map shows a vast network of brooks and rivers, ponds that were connected with well-worn pathways, fords, and a few small bridges known to the integrated kinship network of the Pecumtuck, the Norwottuck, the Waranoco, the Agawam, and the Nipmuc, all part of the Abenaki homeland of this, what we now know as Western Massachusetts. As Native people recognized, and Jill Lepore observed in her 1998 book called The Name of War, Englishmen avoided marshes and swamps. They desired them to be drained and cleared. They found them not only frightening, but unnavigable. Cattle and horses became easily mired, and settlers came to view swamps as places that neither horse nor English foot without great difficulty can pass. So on the right, we see the West Springfield Dam, formerly called the DSI Dam in Massachusetts, which is the first dam on the Westfield River, located 4 miles upstream of where the river joins the Connecticut River. And the Westfield River is about 75 miles upstream from the Long Island Sound. The Holyoke Dam is the first dam on the main stem of the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, and is 87 miles upstream of Long Island, the Long Island Sound. And the Turner's Falls Dam and Fish Ladder in Massachusetts is 122 miles. Excuse me one moment, something's blocking me, okay. Upstream of Long Island Sound. So this gives us a little bit of a look of what we're looking at here. Okay. We don't have a lot of information about published information about the way Native Americans fished, but this one incredible watercolor from 1585 done by an Englishman named John White, who accompanied an exploratory expedition to Roanoke Island, shows, painted from life, shows the spearing and the netting and the they would start fires in the canoe at night to attract fish to near the boats. Now this is somewhat fanciful. There are things that probably would not have been in the waters of the coastal area off the coast of North Carolina. We see a hammerhead shark there that's probably not appropriate for this, but it gives us some idea of Native American methods there. The next time we have some mention of the Native American work in fishing is in Mary Rowlandson's captivity document that she published in 1682. And although she does not, Rowlandson herself does not talk about fishing, she really characterized her journey as wandering through a maze. She was, even though only 10 miles away from Lancaster, where she was captured, she felt as though she was in a deep maze of territory that she had no idea what was going on there. Whereas the woman who, the Native American woman, Witamu, who was her captor, and she traveled with Rowlandson, keeping track of her. In Lisa Brooks' book called Our Beloved Kin, she notes that Rowlandson moved through a territory that was familiar to her. The trails and the subsistence sites and gathering places that she recognized from many trips through this area. These, the people with whom they were traveling, the Nipmucks, would have known this place because of the bounty of fish. And Brooks details this in her article that preceded the next book that she came out with in 2016. It shows men's and women's participation in seasonal activities, including fishing, and the understanding of a navigable system of river basin, arboreal, and mountain pathways that formed the rich Pocumtuck, Nipmuc, Norwottuck homeland. Then we get to Deerfield and the contact of Americans who have been negotiating with Native Americans in Dedham for a homeland, some home sites, I should say, in an 8,000 acre parcel in Western Massachusetts as an exchange for Native American homeland in Eastern Massachusetts. The deed that is ultimately signed between the Pocumtuck and the settlers by the Pocumtuck leader Chalk and John Pinchon, the representative of the settlers, shows that there is a preservation of the usufruct rights for fishing and hunting and the gathering of nuts and other wild foods. But the text, while the text appears to preserve those rights, it appears that there is really no intention on the part of the English, according to the Native Americans, to actually do that, because the surveyor, Joshua Fisher, had depicted 8,000 acres of empty land, according to Margaret Bruchac, and made no mention of the native presence, despite the extant planting fields, wigwam sites, burial grounds, and trails. Surveyors measured out 43 home lots on both sides of a 6-rod wide, 1 mile long north-south street, with the eastern boundaries stopping right at the foot of the Pocumtuck Range, falling just short of the site of the Pocumtuck Fort. And then we get to the way the river may have looked in a further north section. This is a sketched recreation of what the river might have looked like at the Great Falls between Montague and Gill. This is created by the archaeologist and historian Peter Thomas, with his, after looking at a number of geological records and the historical record. But within 20 years of the signing of the deed at what became Deerfield in Pocumtuck, Massachusetts Bay Colony had legislated its own authority to the taking of inland fish specific to the Connecticut River. And we will take a look at those laws as we move forward here. There are a total of more than 15 laws actually specific to the Connecticut, and numerous other laws that talk about fishing, inland fishing in general. Laws that were enacted to either preserve fish or preserve industry. So we want to understand how those laws affected the riverine food supply and the Connecticut River and its people. So what were some of these laws? From 1709 to the end of what this document here called the laws relating to the inland fisheries, as far as 1886. So the laws that were laid out in this document start in 1623, but it's not until 1709 that we understand how Massachusetts Bay Colony does legislate that no weirs, hedges, fish garths, stakes, kittles, or other disturbances or encumbrance should be set or erected in the rivers. This is exactly what the article that we looked at earlier in the Springfield Republican was objecting to, because in Connecticut there were no such laws. So these kinds of encumbrances, as they are known by the law, and the the netting of the fish went without restriction whatever. So from 1709 right up through 1886, we see laws reflected from the beginning of the ancient charters that allowed people to fish for free in any of these rivers and to only net fish according to the local courts. So if you wanted to net fish or set up a weir or seine fishing, do seine fishing with nets that stretched across whole sections of the river, you could apply for a permit with your local court, and it would be addressed in that way. And that is how the fishing industry actually developed in this area of the Connecticut River between sort of the Holyoke Dam and an area south of Springfield, all the way down to sort of Long Meadow. Further laws were enacted after 1886, of course, but we'll be talking about those that happened sort of in the 18th and 19th century. And what about the way these laws were not only enacted but enforced, right? So here we're looking at on the lower left-hand side of the screen here, we see a document that was written by an attorney who later became a very famous judge in Massachusetts, Theophilus Parsons. This is his notebook from his own work in Cambridge in Middlesex County, where his client, David Bearson, had been caught obstructing the passage of fish in the season, and was brought to court by a complaint of someone in his town, and was assessed a fine of £50, which is a huge amount of money in today's thousands of dollars in today's money. So you can see that it was taken quite seriously. And for those who did follow the law, there was such an abundance of fish as to supply the food needs of families in that lean season during the early spring months, before wild foods became available and animal foods were harvested and processed, which mostly took place during the fall. The spring spawning migration brought a great supply of valued food fish up the Connecticut River between April and May and early July. Salmon, shad, striped bass, herring, and eel. The Holyoke um, the Hadley historian Sylvester Judd wrote in his history of Hadley a great 5-page paper on how fishing took place in uh, along the Connecticut on both sides of the Connecticut River. Um, and you can see here that he talks about how people on both sides of the river were were came on horseback. They stayed at farmhouses on the east and west shores alike, and farmers would open their houses and lodge these people who came to secure their own supply of salmon or shad to salt down. And it's incredible to think that perhaps as many as 1,500 horses on both sides of the river um, would be there with people who were fishing and playing cards, and it was really almost a festival atmosphere. Um, we take a look at the way the river looked before the building of the dam. This is what would become known as Holyoke. On the right hand side of the river, you're looking at the Carew Mill in South Hadley Falls. And we can't see the west side of the river from here, but you can note that there are little islands in the river there that were used to haul seines in during fishing times. And if we step away from the river for a moment, we can also see that there was a great impact of the fishing commerce on riverside and rural communities along the Connecticut. In addition to the numerous commercial fisheries clustered around the Springfield parishes, of which Ireland Parish was the most northerly. This is what became Holyoke. Householders and retailers would come to the river to fish for themselves or to purchase fish for resale in rural towns beyond the river's edge. And even those ashore had a role to play. There were innkeepers, two innkeepers at the rivers, at the falls, and then up on the highlands, we see the Craft Tavern that was originally Abner Miller's Tavern, bought in 1832 by Chester Craft. These are the Chesters, I call them. Chester Craft, who bought the tavern, and it was a home to a lot of fishermen during the season and in the run up to the season when they were planning how they were going to set this up. And another young entrepreneur, this is a picture of Chester Chapin when he was an older gentleman. But when he was a young guy in his 20s and was teaching at the local academy, he took a leave of absence from his teaching duties during the fishing season, and participated himself in the spring shad harvest. Chapin invested in a puncheon of rum, which is a 132-gallon cask or barrel, and a deep supply of local cigars. And he set up a little concession in one of the shad houses on the riverside on the west side, making flip with ale and rum and spice, and selling cigars right by the river's edge. So this pungent early 19th century, combining the smells of the fisheries and of rum and cigar smoke, and likely the manure of more than 1,000 horses, must have wrapped the Hadley Falls environs in an earthy spring tang. And in 2 months' time, of course, the fishing season was over. Fishermen stood to make a substantial profit by a division of strenuous labors. The seining and packing and salting and marketing of their heavy portion of the catch took a lot of planning. And part of that planning included walking along the river bottom in the shallow sections of the river in a grid, combing the river bottom to remove boulders and other net snagging obstacles. So in addition to scoop nets, fishermen employed this draw seine method of fishing. A net weighted at the bottom and buoyed at the top, like the one you see on the left here, was paid out from boats in the river. You can see the boats there as well. And these nets described a large oval, and the captain would direct the proceedings from his vantage point at the boat's stern, which was the apex of the operation. The seiners, men, took their places around the net every few feet of what could have been as much as a 300-foot oval of fish net, guiding its progress into the madness of the migrating school of shad, to ensure that neither the base nor the floats of the nets were hung up. And nets full of fish would come ashore at the appointed wharf locations, of which there were more than 14 just below the falls at Holyoke or at Hadley. And they would be drawn up. Now, this picture on the right is from the Potomac. It is not from the Connecticut River, but this is taking place at about the same time, and you can see how many people it takes to draw a net full of fish up onto shore, at which time they would be gutted or not, salted, shoveled into barrels, and prepared for distribution to other markets away from the actual fishing grounds in Springfield. And from Springfield, they would be sent to markets in Boston and New York and beyond. There's some evidence to indicate that Connecticut shad also made it as far as the islands of the Caribbean, where many enslaved Africans would be fed shad from the Northeast. Connecticut River shad had enjoyed a great reputation. There's this food writer from New York City who was also a butcher and an entrepreneur, who wrote this incredible collection of all the foods that were available in the New York City market. He writes a 3-page article on shad alone and talks about the shad that came to New York City from from the Potomac all the way up to Maine. But he cited the best shad came from the Connecticut River, and they were known, as this says, by their superior size, length, and square-shaped back. There are numerous cookbooks that came out of the New York City area in the mid to late 19th century that all reflected the spring shad fishing time, that when shad would be on the menus, the special menus of many restaurants in the city. They commanded a higher price than Connecticut River shad commanded a higher price than many other shad that would come from rivers south of the city. But lest we think that the Connecticut River was alone in its migration and its focus on the anadromous species that connected us to the fish and to our food supply. This map shows us a little bit about what the migratory lay of the land looked like south of Massachusetts. You can see the Connecticut River migration up in Massachusetts. I'm not sure if you can see what I'm doing with my pointer here. Can you see that, Penny? But it also shows the Delmarva Peninsula all the way down to the Carolinas, and it continues all the way down to Florida. So that what we're seeing here is shad migration beginning in January in Florida and moving up all the way into the Canadian Maritimes by July. This is the shad migration map, and although salmon were caught in both the Hudson and the Connecticut River during the time of the Little Ice Age in the 16, 17, and early 1800s. Really was over by about 1805. Now the southernmost reach of the salmon migration really goes only as far south as the Penobscot River. Occasionally, people will find some salmon coming up the Merrimack, but for the most part, the salmon migration has retreated further north to Maine. By 1872, after the historical moment of the commercial shad fisheries, fishing for food fish, shad, salmon, alewife, striped bass, trout, and other species was still good sport. And above the industrial pollution of the burgeoning developments of Holyoke and Springfield, eminently edible. Some might say choice. One such angler, Thomas Chalmers, was interviewed in July of 1871 for a short piece that appeared in the 1872 issue, a September 1872 issue of Scientific American. It was an experiment, he said, and in 1 month, this 1 month experiment, he took 168 shad on 2 poles. And in one evening between 7 and 8:30, Chalmers and a companion took 20 shad with hook and line and found it some of the best angling they had ever experienced. in this undated photo from the Connecticut, uh, oops, excuse me here, I just need to forward myself. Connecticut River Museum in Essex, Connecticut. Three young fishermen who looked like brothers to me displayed their catch, shad and one eel. Um, the museum on the banks of the Connecticut River, uh, prior to COVID, has organized an annual shad bake. And there are shad festivals here in Holyoke, the Shad Derby, and the Shad Festival in Windsor. By the time we get to the mid 19th century and the building of the Holyoke Dam and its diversion of river water to power industry in the planned city of Holyoke that grew up on what had been a very productive hayfield in Ireland Parish. Really, the fish cannot find their way up through um, the fishways that were developed and put along the side of the waterway. Um, and it wasn't really until the 1955 building and completion of the fishway elevator by the Holyoke Gas and Electric Company that fish could make it up over this dam. This was a 30-foot dam, and it effectively cut off the migration of fish into their typical spawning grounds up in Franklin County, and even just a little bit further north than the Holyoke Dam itself. So what we see here is in the map on the right here. What we're looking at is, if you can, I'm not sure if I have a pointer, if this pointer is working, but the raceway that brings water into this system of canals that eventually just powers the industry before really the advent of electricity. And this is what helped build industry along the Connecticut. We know that there was a lot of pushback about the development of Holyoke because of the way it was going to impact the fisheries. And there were laws that went both ways. By 1867, there was an inland fisheries, a fisheries commission that helped to preserve the fisheries for the Connecticut, the people along the Connecticut River. But those whose idea moved toward industry said that a few fish were not enough to stop the development of industry, and indeed the fisheries did kind of lose out. But because of the Fisheries Commission, a man named Theodore Lyman, who was the first secretary and then became the director of the Fisheries Commission, was really the first environmentalist and never stopped working to help preserve the migration of the anadromous fish upriver. So when we get to the mid 20th century and before the Fishways elevator at the Robert Barrett Fishways elevator, the river was in a pretty terrible state, between dams that prevented fish from coming up the river and the pollution that was being emptied into the river. it, the Connecticut River was known as the most beautifully landscaped sewer in the eastern seaboard. Um, but the seed of environmentalism was planted during this time in the 1860s and continued right through to the present day. Of course, now that we have now with the work the last few decades of the Connecticut River Conservancy that is cleaning up the river and preserving uh, the habitat of many fish species. And there are places further north in the river where fishing is edible. And so we are looking forward to the return of the fish uh, as a nutritional part of the Western Massachusetts culinary scene. The fact that we have so many artisanal um, developments with food, especially fish. There's an upcoming uh, conference called Slow Fish, which is part of the slow food movement. It will um, address these issues and many others to help promote and preserve the the habitat and the retail marketing of fish for us. And as a sidelight here, I'd like to talk a little bit about cooking some shad, because in the spring when they start to run, there's so many you definitely need to have some recipes. And so the we have one for tempura here, and I think I can provide Penny with a link to some of these recipes. But the most important thing is how to bone these fish. Native Americans called this fish the inside-out porcupine because of the number of bones, hundreds of bones, in 5 distinct lines along the fillets. And there, if you can imagine going down each side of these lines of bones, each of these 5 lines of bones with a sharp knife, and cutting right down to the skin, but not through it. Each of these lines of bones can then be peeled away, and you end up with a nice looking fillet. And these pictures I took at the Connecticut River Museum's shad bake, which used to happen every week in the first week of June. And I'm sure it will again, although it has been canceled for this year. You see someone actually boning the shad now, and this is what the fillets look like once they have been boned and being prepared to be smoked and roasted at a fireside. We see some thin slices of salt pork laid across the fillets as they are nailed to some oak planks that would then be set up around a fire. You can see what that looks like, and over a period of several many minutes, between, I would say, 45 minutes to an hour and a half. These shad fillets are beautifully smoked and delicious and served in under a big tent at Essex, and it's a great festival. And here's a recipe for planked shad. This is my recipe. It's something like you might find for a roasted salmon of a similar kind of thing, where you use a sweet, a salt, and a sour with some onions or garlic and some seasonings. This one has tamari soy sauce, a maple syrup, and lemon juice, but you can use any sort of salty liquid or just plain salt, and honey or um, other sweetener. You can use lemon juice or vinegar. Um, I like to use plenty of black pepper and ground coriander, um, and I either use sliced salt pork or bacon across the fillets before nailing them to the plank. And the other important thing is that there are hen shad and buck shad. And as the shad migrate up the river, the hen shad have these large sacks of roe um, in their bellies, and if they are carefully um, if they are carefully cut into when you're boning them without cutting through too deeply, you can remove the sacks whole. These fish can be anywhere from sort of 3 to as much as 7 or 8 pounds. So you can imagine these are quite large sacks, and they're a very wonderful delicacy that is enjoyed by a lot of people in the spring. And you just need to, I like to bring mine to room temperature before I saute them, and then season them first for about 15 to 20 minutes. And when I'm ready to begin cooking, I heat olive oil in the pan and then throw a little bit of butter in, so it's about half and half. Dredge the roe with additionally seasoned flour and lay them into the hot fat, um, and cook them for, just depending on the size of the roe, somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes per side. They can be served with a lemon butter or an anchovy butter, or just a squeeze of lemon. And so when will the shad run? Well, some people say that when you see shad bush in bloom along the river's edge, and this is a picture of the shad bush, that is when the shads start running. And other migratory fish often will come later. Salmon, when they were migrating up the Connecticut, would follow the shad, as would the striped bass. But sometime in mid to late April, depending on the temperature of the water, if it's below 50 to 55 degrees, usually the shad will not ascend the river. So it depends, as I say, on the temperature of the spring and the temperature of the water. So we'll look forward to that this spring, and I hope that river will find you all out there, taking your shot at catching a few shad and bringing them to your table, and enjoying what is a great nutritional resource that this river offers us, and many of the small tributary rivers as well. The Agawam, the Westfield, the Chicopee, the Deerfield. You can find shad in all these rivers come May for sure. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Elyse. That was really good. We did see your pointer. It worked fine. So that
Okay, good.
was
Yeah.
good. So if anybody has any questions, I'm going to see if I can stop your sharing and we can all get on the screen. Let's see. But feel free to type in your in the chat or speak up. You're welcome to, unmute and speak up with a question.
Deb Burrows. Hi, Deb Burrows. Sue Samariski. Claire Carlson. I know a few of those people.
I love the images that you had of the nets. So often you hear about net fishing, and I can never really figure out how you can actually catch something with net because I have a very limited imagination about what nets look like. So if anybody has any other questions for Elyse? Yes, a recording. We have been recording it and live streaming it, so there will be a recording available. If you go to YouTube and look at Wisteria Hearst Museum, you'll find all of our recordings there. And feel free to share that recording, with other folks that you think might be interested. We're getting ready to hit that shad season soon. Claire Carlson asks, did you find any references to fish weirs in the Connecticut River?
I know that Native American fishing practices included weirs. And so these weirs would often be just a collection of often willow branches woven into stakes that were driven into the river. But weirs themselves were discouraged because of the way that they blocked the ascension of the fish up the stream, the channel during migrating times. Unfortunately, the area where you want to set up your weir is exactly the area where the fish need to swim to get up the river, and there was a bit of conflict about that. So I did find incidents of fish weirs being set up, but as I said, the netting seemed to be the more popular method, at least for fishermen of that time.
Are there any other questions? I know as a kid growing up in Connecticut, northwestern Connecticut, listening to Bob Steele in the morning out of Hartford, in the spring he would give a report about the shad and how many were in the, how many people were fishing and how much they caught and all of that. So it really is a kind of a New England, Connecticut thing to know about shad. I'm curious about other communities in other rivers that are affected, like in Rhode Island, Eastern Massachusetts.
I know that the Springfield Republican and other area newspapers would publish the size of the catch on a daily basis, and would estimate the annual catch even before the Fisheries Commission began keeping accurate records of that catch.
Robert Loesch asks, how many striped bass and herring continue to come up the Connecticut? Any idea?
Well, I think that is a question for the Connecticut River Conservancy. I think that there are many fewer striped bass that come this far north in the river. They can be caught toward the mouth of the Connecticut more readily, and they are some great fishing and really good eating. Striped bass is among my favorite.
Yeah. Speaking of that, David Ostrander asks, I don't believe I've ever eaten shad. What does it taste like? Salmon, trout, haddock?
It Um, I think it is more like mackerel. It is a fairly oily fish, but when it's fresh and boned and smoked, it has a wonderful flavor, not unlike mackerel. Um, or bluefish for that matter. Not like salmon. I would say definitely does not have the taste of salmon. Um, the texture is close to salmon, I would say, um, but really quite delicious. And although in the early the early part of the uh, when shad fishing first started to become popular in the Connecticut Valley in the 1700s. It was known amongst people who thought that anything associated with the culture of Native Americans was somehow not to be replicated. And most of the English people were more dependent on beef and pork in their diets and thought that anybody who ate shad certainly must not have enough pork in their larder, and it was referred to as not having a competency, which is to say, not having enough food, and so um, they avoided eating fishing for shad and eating shad. That being said, with by the time we get to the late 18th century and people actually discovered how delicious it was, um, people were um, taking it to their own tables. There is one story that appears in Sylvester Judd's History of Hadley, where a family was having a dinner of shad, and somebody knocked at the door, and the plate of shad was taken and slid under a bed so that when the person came into the house, they wouldn't know that the family was eating shad. So it's kind of an interesting.
And Anne Barone says the Westfield River Watershed Association sponsors a free one-day open house fish ladder on the river in West Springfield at the dam near the old Southworth paper mill dam. So
there was a very important fishery located near that area, across from what we know as Riverdale now. It is called Double Ditch, and it's hard to find on any contemporary map, but in the old historical accounts, Double Ditch down there by the Westfield River was one of the most productive fisheries in all of this section between Holyoke and Springfield. Yeah.
well, we want to be conscious of everybody's time, and thank you all for showing up. Elyse, that was wonderful information. I can't wait to go down to the Essex Shad Festival next year and
It's
see
a
it all.
beautiful place right on the river, near the mouth of the Connecticut. I encourage everyone to go. I'm sure that by 2022 we'll be back doing the things that we should be doing.
And if you can send me those recipes,
Yes,
we'd be
indeed.
happy to share them with the folks who attended today.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see you at our next one in